lifting up Jesus, opening his word from Australia, Denmark, Israel, Japan, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Singapore, South Africa, United Kingdom, Thailand, the Philippines, United States, and throughout the world. You're watching Moriel TV. Hi, this is Tim from Moriel TV and Moriel Radio. I'm here live with James Jacob Prasch. Jacob is in Tokyo right now, and this is This Week in Prophecy.
Blessings in Jesus, dear friends, coming to you from Tokyo, as Tim pointed out, and we look at This Week in Prophecy once again, and as usual, it is not a week without events of prophetic significance. Being in Asia, we've been discussing the conflict between Islam and moderate countries in Asia, where it's finally been admitted that the Rohingya, that is the tribal people who are being or have been forcibly removed to Bangladesh from southern Myanmar, are indeed infiltrated and perforated by radical Islamists funded from the Persian Gulf. We've been warning about this for a long time, but the mainstream media has made these people out to be pure victims, even condemning moderate elements of the Burmese government of Myanmar in reaction to what they're doing. The truth has not been told. One of the people who's most misrepresented the facts and ignored what's really happening is Pope Francis, who has taken the side of the Rohingya without even taking into account the fact that there is a radical Islamic element that permeates it and that is threatening the stability of the region. Well, it is beginning to come out this week, at least in the press and media in Asia. Again, the conflict with Islam is becoming increasingly global. In Japan, where I'm at the moment, there's a demographic time bomb with the population of Japan aging so rapidly that Japan is selling more geriatric nappies than they are pediatric nappies for babies, for incontinent senior citizens. You've got people in Japan with a high longevity in their 90s, but their children are in their 70s, are unable to take care of aged parents because they're aging themselves. To solve this, Japan has been forced to look to immigration to foreign countries where people would have an economic incentive to come to Japan. Unfortunately, one has been Indonesia. Now, the churches are growing in Indonesia, but radical Islam is abundant in much of Indonesia, particularly in the Banda Aceh region. You see more and more influence in Japan of people saying, or signs and with government sponsorship, inviting refugees, inviting people with inducements saying we have halal food, writing in Arabic and in the Bahasa language of Indonesia and Malaysia. This demographic time bomb has caused Japan to look elsewhere. Unfortunately, the elsewheres it's looking are, in some cases, Islamic countries where there is a growing radicalism. It is for sure that unless the Lord returns, and this continues, there will be conflict in Japan with Islam the same as there has been anywhere else. No country has allowed Islamic immigration that has not wound up with social turmoil, violence, and terror. None. Are we saying that all Muslims are terrorists? No. But the percentage of Muslims who are terrorists or who are sympathetic to terror is much higher than the Western governments and mainstream media have admitted or maintained. And to date, there is no way to screen the ones who are from the ones who aren't. Particularly complicated is the fact that they may radicalize after arrival, while not being radical when they first immigrate to a Western country or a democratic country. They become that after getting there. We've seen this in Great Britain. Now we're seeing this trend in the United States. More of that in a moment. But it's beginning in Asia. The same kind of struggles with Islam that we've seen in Europe, in the United States after September 11th, And of course, as we've always seen in Israel, now we're beginning to see it in the Far East. But this week in prophecy, events have begun to surface more acutely than they have previously concerning the rise of Islam in the Orient. Let's move on. This week in prophecy, we've been urging prayer for President Trump and Vice President Pence. It is our conviction there is a spiritual battle over them and over their administration. Again, our position is not to editorialize politically, but to pray for the president, to pray that the Lord will guide him in his decisions, which in some cases God plainly has thus far done, and that justice will prevail. After losing the election, Hillary Clinton was a very unpopular candidate because of her perceived corruption on a wide scale. The left, the mainstream media, the progressivists, and the people who have taken control of most of the Democratic Party went on the warpath trying to blame Russian collusion. So far, of course, no evidence has been produced that would be anyway indictable of Mr. Trump for these actions. The things with General Flynn did not come near Mr. Trump personally. There's no evidence of it. But what has surfaced is this. It was the left wing of the Democratic Party and the Hillary Clinton campaign and her adjutants who were involved in the Russian dossier. They initiated it and then blamed Donald Trump for colluding with the Russians to defeat Hillary Clinton when they, in fact, acted in collusion with the Russians themselves. The Russian case against Mr. Trump is falling to pieces. So now they are moving to allegations of removing him for sexual impropriety. The hypocrisy of this is astounding. Judge Moore became the victim not simply of the Democrats, but of the corrupt Republican Party establishment. The fact of the matter is he denied the charges against him that were never proven. There is a case of the yearbook forgery. There is the case of lack of credibility of the witnesses against him. There is the case that even some of their own families say the things they were alleging were not true. Nonetheless, allegations were treated as true. It was not like Bill Clinton, where his misdeeds in the Oval Office with Monica Lewinsky were proven and he was disbarred as a lawyer for perjury. It's not like Al Franken when it was caught on film or Charles Conyers. These are just allegations. The idea that you can bring a barrage of allegations with no conviction, even though the source of the allegations lack credibility in certain key areas that will be brought out in any kind of a trial. There's a de facto indictment and a presumption not of innocence but of guilt. Judge Moore is hated because of the Ten Commandments battle and because of his belief in Judeo-Christian values being used to govern legislation and the judiciary. He's hated by the left for this. Now, it was his opponent in the primaries who Mr. Trump endorsed, but it was the Democratic choice of the voters of Alabama to nominate as their candidate Judge Moore, and so Mr. Trump stood by him against the Republican Party establishment. People like Mitch McConnell, Condoleezza Rice, and the friends of the Bush dynasty, etc., who wanted him out. It was a shame and a disgrace with no proof of guilt. No proof. Charges he denies, a lack of credibility among his accusers, at least one instance of what amounts to de facto forgery, and yet these things are supposed to stand not just as accusatory, but as a de facto indictment with a presumption of guilt. And that became the basis to defeat him. The corrupt Democratic Party, which is as corrupt as the Republican Party establishment, was willing to have its sacrificial lambs. It was willing to throw Al Franken and arguably Charles Conyers to the wolves themselves in order to have a platform. But the real target was not Judge Moore. The target is, of course, Mr. Trump, based on past alleged episodes with women that were of an improper nature. Even though he apologized for his quote-unquote locker room banter and vulgarity, and 53% of women, white women, voted for him, as did a fair percentage of Hispanic women and a small percentage of Afro-American women. Women forgave him. It's simply a political tool. It's not about sexual morality or sexual harassment. The hypocrisy of Kristen Gillibrand, senator from New York. She said nothing about the Clintons. Nothing. It was not an issue. She defended Linda Sarsour, a fundamentalist Islamist who calls herself a feminist, who attacked underage Muslim girls who protested forced female circumcision and genital mutilation. She attacked the victims, and she attacked those who stood up for the victims. This is Linda Sarsour, and she was defended in one of the most stinking anti-women acts of hypocrisy imaginable by the senator from New York.
Our State of the U.S. segment tonight. Want to run for president as a Democrat? Well, better cozy up to the anti-Semite left then. That's what Senator Kirsten Gillibrand is doing as she gears up to challenge President Trump for the Oval Office in 2020. Gillibrand will keynote the BDS-funded Brooklyn Conference. As if that isn't bad enough, she'll be sharing the stage with none other than Women's March co-founder and virulent anti-Semite Linda Sarsour. With me now to break this down, former IDF soldier Mika Danzig. Mika, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Liz.
Mika, this is quite stunning. The left isn't even trying to hide anymore the fact that they are courting anti-Semites in order to gain votes for their presidential hopes in 2020. But Senator Gillibrand she's the keynote speaker at the Brooklyn Conference that is funded primarily by the BDS movement. Mika, explain to our viewers, what is the BDS movement?
So the BDS movement, I call it a campaign because it's not a movement. If it was a movement, it would be far broader in its reach. But the BDS campaign stands for Boycott, Divest, Sanctions, and they seek only to promote the boycotting, divestiture, and sanction of one country in the world based on its alleged human rights violations, and that's Israel. If it was a movement, then they would apply the standard of international law, which is to go after the worst first. So they would be looking to promote, for example, boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning Cuba or North Korea or Pakistan or, frankly, every one of the Arab countries in the world, because all of them have human rights records that are far, far worse than Israel. In fact, I would challenge anybody to name a country that faces similar threats to Israel, both internal and external, that has anywhere remotely as good a human rights record as Israel. They can't.
Right.
So this is just a uniquely, it is a campaign going after the Jew among the nations, Israel. Before 1948, there were boycott campaigns throughout the world, famously in Europe, of course, under the Nazi regime, but prior to that in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which were looking to boycott Jews individually in their business. And now, instead of going after Jews individually, even though the BDS movement does that too, they're going after the Jew among the nations, Israel. It's unique.
Right. I mean, in a nutshell, it's anti-Semitism. They are making false accusations against the nation of Israel because it's a Jewish nation, false accusations of racism, I should say, and human rights violations. And they want the United States to stop aid to one of our greatest allies in the world, Israel. It's ridiculous. Now, this conference that Senator Gillibrand is speaking at, it is funded by this movement, by the BDS movement. It is also funded by the Open Society Foundation. That, of course, is George Soros's foundation. But the striking part of this is that last year, the Open Society's foundation, their emails leaked to the public. In these emails was discussions of how one of their primary goals this year after the election was going to be to erode Israel's democracy and standing in the world.
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that when you look at the Open Society Foundation, when you look at the BDS campaign and its founders, their goal is not a just peace in the Middle East. Their goal is not to increase human rights in the Middle East, because if they were, then they would certainly be looking at human rights all over the Middle East and not just in Israel or dealing with Israel. Their goal is to destroy Israel as a Jewish state, period, end of sentence. And for our elected officials to associate themselves with groups that have that as their stated goal is just such a sad statement about how things have turned, particularly now with the Democratic Party, which has skewed since particularly the election campaign of Bernie Sanders so far to the left.
Right, and this is the topic that you and I talk about almost on a weekly basis, how Democrats claim to stand up, they claim to decry racism, but truthfully, they're courting racist voters right now. They are actively stirring up the poison that is anti-Semitism. And they're not even hiding it anymore. That is a part of their mainstream liberal platform at this point. So the third, and I do want to mention this, so at this conference, Senator Gillibrand, by the way, has hopes for 2020. She wants to run on the Democratic ticket against President Trump. It's pretty obvious by her actions, even if she hasn't verbalized it as yet. So she's speaking at this conference that's funded by the BDS movement. It's funded by the Open Society Foundation, and she's going to be sharing a stage with the co-organizer of the Women's March, Linda Sarsour. Now, Linda Sarsour, Mika, you and I have discussed before, right. She is also openly anti-Semitic. She has compared Zionists to white supremacists and said that there is no place for Zionists in feminism.
That's right. She's famously said that a person can't be both a Zionist and a feminist, which is ludicrous, of course. We all know that unlike the societies and the governments that she has openly promoted, including societies that employ Sharia law, who are exactly the opposite of feminists, the state of Israel is uniquely a place where a feminist can support. It's one of the few states in the world where they've had a head of government, a head of state, who's a woman. It's one of the few states in the world where the head of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is a woman. It's one of the few states in the entire world, and certainly outside of the Western world, where women vote and have equal rights in everything. So for Linda Sarsour to say that you can't be a Zionist and a feminist reveals how anti-Semitic she is. And she, of course, is openly against the idea of a state for the Jewish people. The idea that the Jews, like every other people in the world, are entitled to self-determination and sovereignty and freedom, their national civil rights. She's opposed to that. And Gillibrand, in her move further and further to the left, remember, this senator started out as a blue dog Democrat in the Congress. She was pro-gun. She was a blue dog Democrat in the Congress. And as she's become a senator and now looking at the national political scene more and more, she's moved more and more to the left. This isn't about her true political views. This is about political opportunism.
Right, it's pandering. She's hobnobbing with radicals just to get votes for 2020, or so she hopes. The last problem with this conference, and it is rife with problems, the two of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, that's Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi. They're, of course, three founders of this movement. They're both giving speeches at this conference, too. The problem with this is, first of all, it has nothing to do with the Black Lives Matter movement, but Alicia Garza has defended Black Lives Matter's inclusion of the BDS movement within their platform, which you'd think would have absolutely nothing to do with what she claims that their organization stands up for, unless, of course, Black Lives Matter isn't what it appears to be. But she's defended anti-Semitism as well, which shows me what you and I say every week, that this anti-Semitism is infiltrating every possible little segment of the Democratic Party. Every little segment of liberal movements is now rife with anti-Semitism, and we can see it before our eyes.
Yeah, it's truly frightening. Again, you know, the overwhelming majority of Jews in America support equal civil rights for African Americans, support many aspects of the BLM, the Black Lives Matter platform. And yet, despite that, the BLM platform contains in it a sanction and a demand for repercussions against only one country on earth, the Jewish state. They don't talk about any other areas. They don't talk about the fact that in Libya today, Africans are being sold into slavery. They don't talk about the fact that Saudi Arabia, Qatar are still involved in the persecution of indigenous Africans, that slavery is technically still, of indigenous Africans still occurs in numerous Arab countries. They don't talk about any of that. They only talk about the one state in the world that has actually brought people from Africa, indigenous Africans, to its homeland to free them, not to enslave them, Israel. That's the only state that they actually have the temerity to call out for sanction in their platform.
Right. The only intersectionality that these groups practice, and of course they claim to practice that intersectionality, is hypocrisy. They're hypocritical once you look right below the surface. Mika, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Can you imagine? Genital mutilation, clitorectomy. Sarsour defends it, and she defends Sarsour. And now she's going after Mr. Trump as if she's got a self-righteous cause, when she said nothing about Bill Clinton doing what he did in the Oval Office, who was disbarred for perjury for lying about it. Again, it is not about sexual harassment or the rights of women. Nobody could care less about the rights of women than that senator from the state of New York. But that's the name of the game. And that's what's happening. This week in prophecy, there's been another sad episode. And ministry that I've always liked and have been partial to has put some material into the public domain which we believe is unfair and unreasonable. Israel is a very, very small country. Its economy is not big compared to the major economies of Europe, North America, or the bigger economies in the Far East. It's not that big. Yet somehow Israel has been able to absorb not only millions of Jewish refugees driven out of all kinds of countries, including black African Jews, the Falashas from Ethiopia. So it's not a racial issue. Israel also took Phalangist Christian refugees from Lebanon when they were driven out of their homes in Lebanon by Iranian-backed and Syrian-backed Hezbollah. Israel took Christian refugees from Lebanon. Israel has been as gracious as possible, but it is being swamped by refugees from the Horn of Africa, from Eritrea, because surrounding nations do not want them. Now, initially, we supported giving refugee status to come to the United States to Christians, to black African Christians from Somalia and Eritrea, simply because they had no place else to go. Unfortunately, the corrupt American government gave that status to Muslims, some of whom have attempted or perpetrated acts of terror. They flooded into Minneapolis and into Minnesota, and they were given the status that should have only been given to Christians, because there's no shortage of Muslim countries for those African Muslims to go to. It should have only been for Christians, not Muslims, because the Christians had no place to go. But Israel supported the establishment of a Christian nation in southern Sudan to stop the genocide against Christians. Israel was supportive of it. Then they had a place to go. Now, the infighting and the tribal rivalry within Sudan is not the fault of Israel. Arab militias, followed by African Islamists, have produced an influx of asylum seekers that are both Christian and Muslim. Some were shot trying to enter Egypt by the border guard. Some made it through the Sinai into Israel. Israel has given jobs and accommodation to a fair number of these people. You'll see at the Israeli resorts of Eilat or Ein Bokek a number of Somalians working there, and some of them Christians, some of them Muslims. But having absorbed Christian refugees from Lebanon, in addition to Jewish refugees from the Arab world, and from Iran, and from countries as far afield as Yemen and elsewhere, even from Argentina during the regime that was extremely anti-Semitic under Galtieri. Having absorbed so many Jewish refugees, Israel took on some Christians, as many as it could as a small nation, including black African ones. And a number of the Falashas, although Jewish, believed in Jesus as the Messiah, thanks to the evangelism that has gone on in the Lake Tanya area for decades. They were arriving in Israel as believers. Israel took black Africans, Jewish ones. It took some Muslim ones and a number of Christian ones, as well as other Christians. But Israel does not exist to take non-Jewish refugees. It's done the most it can as a small country. Now, Arabs who are Christians have no place to go. Those people should be given visas to come into Western Europe, into Britain, and into the United States. They do not propose a terror threat. The Christian population of the Middle East have nowhere to go because what had originally been planned in the aftermath of World War I to be an Arab Christian nation, Lebanon, was stolen from them, taken from them. Again, when they had no place to go, it is one thing. But essentially, Jews should go to Israel when they're refugees, as the Falashas did, the black African Jews, the Yemenite Jews, and others. They should go to Israel. That is their land. Muslim refugees should go to Islamic countries. And African refugees should go to Christian nations or Christianized nations in Africa. They should not be coming to the West, and they should not be going to Israel. Israel is for Jews. Africa is for Africans. Christian nations are for Christians. We cannot allow Islamic immigration on the scale we have. It has produced nothing but trouble and will eventually end in some kind of a civil war, not just between Westerners and Muslims, but between moderate Muslims and radical ones. We've already seen this in Egypt, and we are importing it into the West. This is not good. It is bad. It has nothing to do with race. When a refugee has no place to go, it's different. But when they have places to go with their own language and their own culture and their own religion, that is where they should go. It makes no sense bringing them to America or Europe or Israel. None. Christians from Arab countries have no place to go. They're an exception. They are an exception. Before South Sudan existed, from the Horn of Africa, from Djibouti around through Somalia, Eritrea, and Ogaden, they had no place to go, but they do now. The criticism of Israel for failing to take on these people by the Barnabas Fund is most unfortunate. It's a small nation with a small economy that's already heavily pressed economically. It does not have the social service resources on top of the strategic fight it has to wage. It does not have the resources economically on top of funding its strategic battle for survival against radical Islam to absorb Christian refugees from other countries when they have an alternative to go to in their own continents. Israel is for Jewish refugees. It has taken as many Christian and non-Jewish refugees as it can. This has nothing to do with race. It's a small country, has a hard enough time absorbing Jews. It cannot absorb Christians in every case. The criticisms by Barnabas Fund are absolutely appalling. There has also been criticism of Israel because of its being an arms exporter and manufacturer. The scandals in Africa and elsewhere into Asia of international arms industries, of blood diamonds for weapons, of violations of end-user certificates, this is widespread. Our ministry operates in much of Africa, both east, west, and south. Africa is flooded with Russian-made Kalashnikov AK-47s and rocket launchers. There are French, British, American, and Israeli weapons. To single out Israel as somehow a culprit in providing arms to countries like Rwanda or what's happened with the Tamil Tigers in Ceylon is ridiculous. Most of the weapons that came to the conflict with the Tamil Tigers came via India. I'm not saying that Israel is any better than any other country. And a lot of those arms are not necessarily sold directly by Israel. They're sold by third-party brokers, often illegally. And additionally, those arms may have been sold legally before any embargo or before any acts of genocide. But it's Russian, cheap Russian weapons, and now increasingly Chinese weapons that are flooding Africa and other countries. Yes, there are Israeli as well as American and French and British weapons. But these criticisms of Israel are unfair and inequitable. Now, again, I do not deny the good that has been done and is done by Barnabas Fund. But in this case, they're being unreasonable and unfair. Again, it's not about race. When Black African Christians had no Christian country in Africa that they could get to, I agreed with bringing them to Britain, Europe, and the United States. But they have a country to go to now. Israel helped establish it. South Sudan. Israel absorbed Black African Jews, the Falashas, and it has taken on Christians from Lebanon and from Africa as many as it can. But you cannot expect it as a small country struggling to survive economically and strategically against radical Islam to provide social services to people coming all of that distance. They shouldn't be coming those distances to Europe or to Israel. They should go to their own cultures. Now, for those people who have no place to go to, that's different. Again, I was very sympathetic to the Christians from the Horn of Africa, Black Africans, when they had no place to go, and I remain sympathetic to Middle Eastern Christians who are fleeing what's happening in Syria, Iraq, and so forth. But Barnabas Fund is out of order. Its criticisms of Israel are not realistic and not fair. This is not to demean the other good work that they've done in many areas, but I respectfully disagree with what they're doing. It's just not right. This is not to say that Israel is by any means anything other than an imperfect country. But the unreasonable expectations being placed on Israel by the Barnabas Fund are frankly ridiculous. And the criticisms are not balanced. This week in prophecy. In the aftermath of Mr. Trump's recognition of the capital of Israel to be Jerusalem, predictably, he came under tremendous attack. I believe this attack is spiritually orchestrated. It is not simply political. The charge in the counter-reaction has been led by none other than Recep Erdogan from Turkey, as was expected and as we mentioned. He convened a conference, putting himself on the platform as the speaker for the Muslim world, which he certainly is not. There is a long-standing resentment and even hatred between Arabs and Turks, as there is between Arabs and Persians. The artificial basis of unity is the common hatred of the Jews and of Christians in some cases. But Mr. Erdogan has demanded that East Jerusalem be recognized as the capital of a Palestine. Things are taking shape and sizing up. What is interesting is he did it on the virtual anniversary. 100 years since British General Allenby, commander of the ANZUS, Australia, New Zealand, and British forces, defeated the Turkish Ottoman Empire and entered Jerusalem. 100 years. Memories run long. The Turkish genocide of the Armenians, the British defeat of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, 100 years. And Mr. Erdogan is still trying to fight the battle this week in prophecy. Again, these things would all seem to contribute to a Gog and Magog scenario if you are of the view that there are two battles of Gog and Magog, which I personally lean towards. In addition to the one, as we've said, that must take place at the end of the millennial reign of Christ in Revelation, it would appear another one takes place that prefigures it. That is the best I can see through Scripture because of cleaning up the battlefield for 7 months and so forth. And as we pointed out, Arab nations do not feature in it with a partial exception of Libya, but Turkey certainly does, as does Russia, as does Iran. This week in prophecy, Mr. Erdogan has taken another step in that direction. But let us return to the situation of the Somali refugees. It was absolutely wrong for the United States to admit Islamic refugees from the Horn of Africa. One of them, Mohammed Noor, came to the United States and became a policeman. This Mohammed Noor shot an unarmed Australian woman dead when she reported a possible crime. He pulled out his weapon, fired out the window of a police car across the lap of his partner from the passenger side, and shot this Australian woman completely unarmed, shot her dead.
This is a Fox News alert. There is breaking news in the case of the Australian woman shot to death by a police officer in Minneapolis after calling 911 to report a crime. Fox Minneapolis reporter Christina Palladino joins us with details. Christina.
Tucker, this is the alleyway here in southwest Minneapolis where 40-year-old Justine Damon was shot and killed by a Minneapolis police officer. She was shot just a few doors down from her home on Saturday night. We understand that Damon was calling to report a possible assault happening in this alleyway. Now, we just got an update from the state agency investigating. They tell us that the two officers were patrolling in their car with their lights off when Damon came out of nowhere and startled both of them. We understand that 31-year-old officer Mohammed Noor was in the passenger seat. He is the one who shot Damon in the abdomen. She died on scene. Investigators say she did not have a weapon on her, and the body cameras of the police officers, as well as their squad camera video, were not turned on. Now, Damon, she moved here from Sydney, Australia 3 years ago to be with her fiance. She was set to marry him next month in Hawaii.
We've lost the dearest of people, and we're desperate for information. Piecing together Justine's last moments before the homicide would be a small comfort as we grieve this tragedy. The death of Justine is a loss to everyone who knew her. She touched so many people with her loving and generous heart.
Now, Noor has apparently refused to be interviewed by state investigators. The other officer, Matthew Harity, has already sat down with detectives. Noor has been on the force for about 2 years. He's the first Somali-American police officer to be in this precinct, but he already has 3 citizen complaints filed against him. One was closed without discipline. The other 2 remain open, and we are attending a press conference in the next few minutes to hear from the assistant chief, the mayor, and other council members as well. Tucker?
Thanks, Dr. Christina. We appreciate it. Well, there's a lot going on in this story and a lot we don't know. Mohammed Noor was an immigrant from Somalia. Is that a relevant fact? We don't know. But it's being treated as one by many news organizations. How do you know that? Because they're not reporting it. The Washington Post, for example, did a long piece on this shooting and made no mention of Noor's nationality or immigration status. They never even mentioned his name. They wrote an entire story about this and never mentioned the cop's name. Why is that? Vincent Hill is a former Nashville police officer, and he joins us. Mr. Hill, thanks for coming on tonight. So it seems odd. A bunch of things about this seem odd to me, and maybe they're significant and maybe not. First, how common is it for a police officer to shoot someone through the door of a vehicle?
Well, Tucker, thanks for having me on. It's very uncommon for a police officer to shoot outside of a vehicle from the inside. Most departments forbid it. So I question what made this officer, Officer Noor, believe that there was an imminent threat against either his life or his partner's life to shoot 3 times inside that vehicle and strike Ms. Dedman. I really question that.
It seems bizarre. Now, the second notable fact, it seems to me, is the body cams and the dash cam. So at least 3 cameras present, none of them on, either during the shooting, before the shooting, during the shooting, or after the shooting. Why would that be?
Well, Tucker, I don't want to speculate. There could be several reasons. Of course, body cams in general are very new to most police departments across this country. I believe Minneapolis has only been using body cams for about a year. So when officers are approaching a scene of a call, they have a lot that they're thinking about. It could be that the body cam was not one of those. I don't know why the dash cam, if it was available, wasn't on, because, of course, you're responding to a crime or reports of a crime. So
Yes.
at least the dash cam in itself should have been on.
Now, I always give cops the benefit of every doubt because it's a really hard job and a dangerous job. And so maybe this isn't meaningful, but you tell me what you think. This guy had been on the force for 2 years. He had 3 complaints against him. Does it seem like a lot?
For someone to have only been on a department for 2 years, it definitely seems like a lot, especially the last one, I believe, was this past May. So here we are just 2 months removed from that, and now a young lady is dead, and it's very tragic. So I really question what those reports actually said. Was it something that the department should have said, hey, maybe this officer is not fit for duty? So you have to question that.
Yeah, you certainly do. Can you, and again, there's a lot we don't know, and I can't stand it when people speculate irresponsibly. But since you've done this job, can you think of a scenario in which what happened or what we know happened makes sense?
Tucker, I've thought about this all day, and the only thing I can speculate from an officer point of view is there was something that made that officer believe there was an imminent threat against his life. I think there's reports now that there may have been a loud noise by the vehicle. There's reports that she startled these officers, but we have to take into account they received a call that a female was probably being sexually assaulted. So common sense should kick in and say, well, is this possibly the victim, or is this the 911 caller? I know when I've answered 911 calls, I always wanted to speak to the caller to get their perspective, to see if there's a suspect, to see if we need to set up a perimeter. So I don't understand what led this officer to believe not only did he have to take her life, but if you think about it, he put his partner's life in jeopardy by shooting across him.
It's unbelievable. I mean, whatever he thought, he cannot have imagined this was the perpetrator in a sexual assault. You wouldn't think, but who knows? Vincent, thanks a lot for that. It was really helpful.
But he's a Muslim, so he's not been indicted. If a white policeman shot that woman, or if a white policeman shot a black African, we saw what happened in Ferguson. It was all racialized. But there's been no indictment yet. It's politically sensitive to indict a Muslim policeman who shot this woman in cold blood for no reason that anybody can detect. She was unarmed. She simply came out to the police after she called them. He sees this white woman from Australia. He pulls out a gun, reaches over the lap of his partner, and fires, shooting her dead. And he's not been indicted. We don't see riots like we saw in Ferguson, when someone who robs a store and is identified by a policeman attacks the policeman and go for the policeman's gun, and all of a sudden, Michael Brown was the victim. Well, here it was this poor woman from Australia who was the victim. What does this say about America to our friends in Australia and to other countries in the British Commonwealth? What does it say to anyone? The murder of Justine Diamond in July should result in an indictment of this Muslim policeman. Mohammed Noor should be indicted. We had the case this week in prophecy of nominal Christians from non-evangelical traditions, largely in Nazareth, saying they're not going to celebrate Christmas this year as a protest against the American government policies of recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
One place where they will not be saying Merry Christmas this year is Jesus' hometown of Nazareth. Local leaders are canceling a number of the Christmas festivities. They blame President Trump for his decision to declare that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. They say that that has taken the joy out of all of their celebrations, and it has annoyed the Palestinians. So joining us now, Pastor Robert Jeffress has met with the president a couple of times this week, spent a fair amount of time with he and the First Lady, and he's a Fox News contributor. Pastor, good to have you with us tonight.
Thanks.
First of all, explain to us the irritation about the decision, which is, obviously on the face of it, but this decision to remove the Christmas celebrations from Nazareth is quite striking, really, when you think about it.
Well, really, Martha, this is a pretty good year for the Palestinians to skip celebrating Christmas, because the historical account of the birth of Christ actually proves that the Palestinians are absolutely wrong and President Trump is absolutely right about Jerusalem. And here's why. In Luke's gospel, it notes that Jesus was a descendant of King David. We know from history that David's the one who named Jerusalem as Israel's capital in 1000 BC. That's a full 1100 years before the term Palestinian was invented by the Roman Emperor Hadrian. And Tuesday night at the White House Christmas party, President Trump asked me to say a few words before I closed in prayer. And I thanked President Trump for having the guts to do what no other U.S. president has been willing to do. In recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, President Trump is not only on the right side of history, he's on the right side of God.
Well, obviously, there's some backlash in Nazareth, which I guess, as you say, is to be expected. They don't like the origin of the Christmas story and the Christmas tradition. So let me just take a look at a Pew poll that we also found interesting, and I think that people who believe that Christmas is a Christian holiday will find it a little bit disheartening. Those who believe it's a religious holiday, that has declined by 5%. Those who think it's a cultural holiday is now up to 33%. I guess, you know, we have our own materialism to thank for that.
Well, I think so. And look, the tendency of any culture is to become more secular. And as that happens, unbelievers feel empowered to come out of the closet and share what they really believe or what they don't believe. But Martha, opinion polls don't change historical fact. The fact is that we divide human history, we divide our calendars by the birth of Christ. Every time we type or write the year 2017, we are affirming it's been 2017 years since the birth of the Son of God.
Quickly, I mean, you know, what's your message this Christmas to Christians who really want to keep Christ in Christmas and to the rest of the country?
Well, I would remind people that no matter what happens in the world, as the world gets darker and darker, the light of the gospel of Jesus shines that much more brightly. And we have so much to celebrate, and that's what we can concentrate on this year.
Pastor, thank you very much. Good to see you as always. Quick break.
How absurd. In Nazareth, there has been conflict and intimidation with Islamic mosque authorities making claim to traditional church grounds held by Christians. And additionally, beyond that, at Christmas, if you read the Gospel of St. Luke, there's no question Jerusalem is Israel's capital and Jesus was a Jew, yet these so-called churches are protesting, even though they themselves, like most Middle East Christians, suffer repression at the hands of radical Islamists. Their hatred of the Jews and of Israel is stronger than their dislike of their persecutors. We've pointed out for years, one of the key issues that is going to separate, differentiate, distinguish the true body of Christ from the harlot church is going to be Israel and the Jews and their position concerning prophecy for Israel and the Jews. It's not the only issue that's going to separate the harlot church from the true bride of Christ, but it will be a key issue, as we've been saying for nearly 20 years. And this week in prophecy, we've seen it in Nazareth. This week in prophecy, quite a situation. Probably for the first time it has happened in that area of the world. U.S. F-22 fighters were scrambled to intercept in a 40-minute confrontation Russian military aircraft who violated the terms of an agreement between the States and Russia, flying east of the Euphrates River in northern Syria, not far from Iraq. This violated what was agreed with Mr. Putin. The United States scrambled jets to intercept the Russians, but they did something known as butt-heading among pilots. That is, they fired warning flares in the paths of the Russian fighters. Had the radar been locked on, it could have resulted in Americans shooting down Russian planes in a dogfight. Israel has attacked Iran in self-defense in Syria. But this week in prophecy, we had what could have quickly, in a matter of moments, mushroomed into armed aerial conflict between the United States Air Force and the Russian Air Force. Let us pray for the American troops and pilots in Afghanistan, Iraq, and in eastern Syria, as well as for the IDF and for the British and other NATO forces in that region fighting ISIS. This week in prophecy, it happened, an actual scrambling of American fighter aircraft in a hostile environment. Now, there are episodes of this regularly that take place over the Bering Sea between Alaska and Siberia. It's not the only time this has happened, but the fact that they fired flares lifts it up a step. And the fact that it took place where hostilities are already underway by various parties makes it different. Let's continue this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, we've had a problem where judges violating the Constitution and legislating from the bench have determined what American immigration policy should be, even though they have no constitutional or legal mandate for doing so, outruling Mr. Trump's efforts to prevent terrorists from entering the United States, as they were enabled to do so by the Obama administration and by George Bush. Despite the killings in San Bernardino, despite the killings in Orlando, these judges think that we have to give Muslim radicals the right to come in here and to kill Americans. At least that's what they say by their actions. Well, a Muslim who we allowed in attempted to do it in New York City. We have Aqaid Ullah, the Port Authority bus terminal in Manhattan, 7:30 in the morning, with a suicide bomb. Injured no one but himself, but tried to kill many because he was led into this country, which he never should have been. No one knew what was happening or if he was part of a series of planned and coordinated attacks, bearing in mind in London, such attacks on transportation centers in the heart of a big city during commuter hours was orchestrated with a number of people involved. They hit buses, they hit tube trains in London, and these scenarios are studied by Homeland Security, by counterterrorist police, and by the FBI. When it happens in one place, it's always studied internationally. And so the reaction in New York was predictable and justifiable. They went and questioned the person's family immediately to see if they knew anything of who he was in partnership with, who might be willing to strike or ready to strike at Grand Central Station or Pennsylvania Station or LaGuardia Airport. It had to be done. But the Council of American Islamic Relations, whose we've said repeatedly, 3 of its senior officials are indicted conspiracies in the funding of terror after September 11th, an organization that should be investigated by Congress and closed down on grounds of national security. It's funded from the Gulf by fundamentalist Muslims with radical inclinations, obviously. It's been connected with the Muslim Brotherhood. It needs to be closed down and investigated by Congress. Nonetheless, they protested, saying you had no right to take his children or the children of his family out of school and question them. When bombs are going off in the middle of New York City at commuting hours, you grab anybody who may have information and ask them before another bomb goes off, the way they did in London at commuter hours. The CAIR do not care about this. I pray to God that our government finds a way to close it down. Arguably, some of its leaders belong in prison. We need to have legislation that prevents foreign funding of American organizations when those organizations have an anti-American agenda that is a pro-Sharia one, or one that is in any way sympathetic to or cooperative with terror. Once again, the CAIR has struck, and sickeningly and disgustingly, a liberal Jewish lawyer took their case and their cause. We have warned in the past of the Meshumid syndrome, that is, of the Menlaus syndrome. At Hanukkah, Jews remember their Benedict Arnold, who was Menlaus, who cooperated with the Seleucids against the Jewish people in the book of Maccabees. Well, we have Menlauses today, as we pointed out many times. And some of these liberal lawyers, including Conlaw, are among them. This Week in Prophecy. This Week in Prophecy, the Iron Dome, Israel's anti-missile defense system, managed to shoot down at least 4 rockets fired from Gaza at Israel. None of them did any damage except one that fell in northern Gaza at Bet Hanun and struck a school, a UN-constructed and operated school within Gaza to benefit their own children. That's the damage they did. The missile fell on a UN school. I didn't see a big protest from the UN or anything from the media, but of course if the Israelis shot back and hit a school, the world would be up in arms. Nonetheless, it happened this week in prophecy. The Iron Dome performed reasonably well, and Hamas performed reasonably bad. This week in prophecy, Israeli justice prevailed. A militant Jew burned a church in Galilee, as we reported. The indignation of both the president of Israel and the government of Mr. Netanyahu was instant and immediate. Investigation took place on a massive scale, and a radical Jew who was anti-Christian was arrested. His name, Yanan Ruvini. He was put on trial speedily. Evidence was all brought to bear, and the prosecutor wanted the maximum sentence of 9 years for this act of arson as a hate crime against Christians. There were political protests, not so much from the Israeli public, but from certain quarters of the Orthodox community who were saying that Muslim terrorists who've burned synagogues have only gotten 2 years because of political pressure. Therefore, why should a Jew get 9 years? The sentence finally agreed with the court was the maximum they could give under the circumstances was 4 years. Mr. Yanon Ruvini will be locked up for the next 4 years for his hate crime and arson. A Jew in jail in Israel for attacking Christians. Someone else who belongs in jail in New Jersey will probably not go there for inciting violence. In New Jersey, an imam, the Islamic Center in Jersey City, New Jersey, in the shadow of where the World Trade Center towers once stood. Imam Aymin El-Kasabi made the quotations from the Islamic holy books that Jews are apes and pigs and Muslims are obliged to kill them. And he called for the liberation of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is under the control of the Waqf, of the Islamic temple authorities, in conjunction with the Jordanian government. Yet he's calling for the murder of Jews. In the United States! Why did that man enter the United States? Why is he not locked up where he belongs in prison, or at the very least deported and his citizenship removed if he's American? Because he made it on a false pretense. We recall the disgusting spectacle of the governor of New Jersey appointing a Muslim judge to the New Jersey High Court. Chris Christie did that. I'm glad we've seen the end of him. An establishment Republican. No friend of the cause of freedom. There was a judge in Jersey City who also defended a Muslim man's abuse of his wife, saying it's their culture.
I want surveillance of these people. I want surveillance if we have to, and I don't care. Are you ready for this, folks? Are you ready? Oh, they're going to make it such a big deal. They're going to make it so big. He said something so politically incorrect. That's why we're going to hell, because we're so politically incorrect. Such a big deal. Such a big deal. I want surveillance of certain mosques, okay? If that's okay. I want surveillance. And you know what? We've had it before and we'll have it again. Hey, I watched when the World Trade Center came tumbling down. And I watched in Jersey City, New Jersey, where thousands and thousands of people were cheering as that building was coming down. Thousands of people were cheering. So something's going on. We got to find out what it is. I do want surveillance.
Again, Jersey City has become one of the worst places. It goes down with Dearborn, Michigan, and with Minneapolis. But it's right in the shadow of the World Trade Center. This venomous bigot, who actually called for acts of violence against Jews, needs to be arrested and prosecuted for hate crime, for inciting violence. But politically, it probably won't happen. Free speech. People are entitled to have freedom of speech. But when you actually attempt to incite a felony murder, to incite it, not saying I think it should happen, but inciting people and using a religious platform to do it, that is not what the Founding Fathers meant, either by freedom of religion or freedom of speech. Why are people like that allowed to come into the country? In Pakistan this week in prophecy, a 7-year-old Christian was killed. And the Pakistani government has caved in, and it is allowing increased pressure against Christians by tribal courts. The death of this Christian child, little boy, took place at Shaman. In Kazakhstan also, supposedly a secular state with freedom of religion, the Islamic government politicians there have enacted legislation or regulations saying that you must have at least 50 people in order to have a legal church. Well, there are churches with 20 people, 30 people that can just be declared illegal. What if we did that to Muslims in Western countries? What if that same standard that they apply to Christians was applied in Western countries? But again, nobody is saying anything. No, Western governments pander to them increasingly, as we've been warning the government of Germany and Angela Merkel. A planned visit where the Dead Sea Scrolls, or some of them, would be put on display in a German museum had to be canceled. The German Foreign Ministry could not guarantee that the scrolls would be returned to Israel because of demands by Islamic authorities that they be put in the possession of Islam. And Germany would not guarantee the return of the scrolls. The display had to be canceled. This is Angela Merkel, another boot-licking panderer to radical Islam, more than willing to sell her own country down the river. Her and George Bush should get together and have a nice big Texas barbecue. She can bring the Wiener Schnitzel. They're two of a kind. Barack Obama can be the guest of honor. As we recall, it was Barack Obama who engineered a UN resolution saying that Israel was an occupying presence with no claim to its religious sites like the Wailing Wall, after he said he had Israel's back. So he lied to the American Jewish community. The only thing he had for their back was a dagger. Again, my prayer is that the judgment of Christ still comes against those who betrayed Israel and betrayed the Christians of the Middle East, particularly the evangelicals. It was Mr. Obama who turned against Mr. Sisi, favoring the Muslim Brotherhood, sponsors of terror. Thank God that evil man is gone. But the Lord said, I will bless them that bless thee and curse them that curse thee. May God bless Mr. Trump, and may he curse the enemies of Israel and of the body of Christ. Those who pander to these radical expressions of Islam that murder moderate Muslims who want peace, that murder Christians and that murder Jews. This week in prophecy, quite a situation, a decision by the Israeli courts has declared that it is illegal for the Israeli government to hold the corpses of Muslim terrorists for negotiating purposes to get back the corpses of Israelis. You have to give them the dead bodies of their suicide bombers, or what's left of them. You cannot hold those corpses and not return them to the families in order to get the corpses back of the Israelis that they've killed or murdered. We are watching Russia very closely, particularly its relationship with Iran and Turkey, and we always do so. It's important to monitor this. But Mr. Putin announced something, that he's going to run for an unprecedented fourth term, not under the United Russian Party. He says his personal popularity exceeds it. He's going to run as an independent. Again, he wants to be Joseph Stalin II. He's been a consistent enemy of human rights. This week in prophecy, he was blaming the United States for its policies towards Pyongyang, saying that America was being provocative. Putin has to be realized and recognized for the enemy he is. The weapon to bring him down, to bring him to his knees, is undermining his economy. It is an oil-based economy, and it is vulnerable to Western attack, and it must be attacked. That is my personal view. Putin is a very dangerous man. He cannot be trusted. The visa restrictions he's placed on clergy visas, the restrictions he's placed on evangelism, he's a dangerous Russian nationalist, a former KGB agent, who runs a corrupt regime that has done nothing consistently but violate human rights. He's in bed with Iran, he's in bed, or pandering at least, to North Korea. And now he's running for a fourth term. Brings us back to Ezekiel 38 and 39. I will put hooks in your jaws and draw you in. If anybody persuades me that we are heading for a Gog and Magog scenario, most likely, in addition to the one at the end of the millennium, if there's another one that prefigures it, if anyone convinces me that that is likely, it is Vladimir Putin. This week in prophecy. But let's continue. It's interesting to know that the last link we've had with the apostles' teaching was Irenaeus. Irenaeus got his doctrine from the Apostle John via Polycarp, and we have testimonies of this time period from various sources, such as Papias, Hegesippus, and so forth, and Papias. It was reported and taught by Irenaeus and his followers that the Apostle John said the Antichrist will come to power when the iron cannot adhere to the clay, and an attempted reconfederated Roman Empire begins to fall to pieces. That is how the Antichrist will get power, when the iron does not stick to the clay, and he'll put down 3 kings. John said these kings had to do with Libya, it had to do with Egypt and Ethiopia, interesting enough, according to Irenaeus now. We're not basing our doctrine on history, we're simply citing historical record of what the apostle taught according to the best historical traditions we have. UK Brexit suffered a defeat in the British Parliament today when, by a vote of 309 to 305, Theresa May was outvoted. People want more say. These are not simply conservatives. These are people on the left who want to keep Britain in the EU. She is a weak leader who, as we've said, never should have been prime minister. When the nation democratically voted to leave Brexit, they should have gotten a Brexit prime minister, not somebody who was pro-Remain. She's not politically competent. She nearly lost the election to Labour. The Northern Irish, as we've said, saved her neck and saved Britain. But her agenda for the divorce talks with the EU bureaucracy, with the Brussels bureaucracy of the EU, was defeated by 309 to 305 narrowly. Britain needs a new prime minister in our estimation. Now, when I offer these editorial opinions, they are only my own opinions. I'm not saying, thus saith the Lord. It's simply my view in light of what I see in Scripture. But there are some things that it's not thus thinketh Jacob, thus saith the Lord. I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee is one. The need to stand by the persecuted church is another. The need to preach the gospel to the nations of the Middle East, Jew and Arab and Persian alike. And the need to pray for our leaders, for the Mr. Trump and his administration and government, and for the government of Britain. We need to pray and pray earnestly. There is a spiritual battle waging over Jerusalem, over London, over Brussels, over New York, and over Washington. It's even reached to the ends of the earth, here in the Far East where I am now. This week in prophecy. Thank you for listening. Blessings in Jesus from Tokyo. Hopefully speak to you next week. God bless.